In this video, I'll walk you through replacing a fuel tank in a 19-foot flats boat. It's probably the same process for any boat that has a full-size deck access to the fuel tank. First thing I did was cut the silicone all the way around the access and remove the screws that hold it down. I used a come-along with some blocks to lift the console up. The come-along is hooked into the deck plate over the fuel sender. So that worked out really nicely, and with minimal effort it just popped right up. Here's a view of the setup. I put some boards to support the blocks so they didn't fall backwards. And here's a view inside to see the gel coat and fiberglass mess that I was about to encounter. I wanted to make sure I had enough clearance or enough slack in the wiring and rigging, which I did, especially after moving the console back to the bulkhead. I slid a board in under the console and just the weight popped the back up, and I was able to put two boards in to act as a slide to get the console to slide backwards all the way to the bulkhead, and that gave even more slack in the majority of the rigging, which goes back to the transom. This is the only wire that goes up front, and it's for the trolling motor, and there was plenty of slack in it already. So here's the view of the console propped up. This is how we did most of the work. Here's the mess of fiberglass and gel coat that foamed this tank in. I tried to use a chisel and a hammer to break up this fiberglass, and I had to cut it. An air cutter or an air grinder probably would have been way better, given that I'm replacing the tank because of a fuel leak. I set up some fans to try to minimize my chance of exploding, and that worked out well, fortunately. Here's the flanges after they've been cut. Here's probably the best view of the fiberglass and gel coat over the flange, and then here's a view after it's been cut and cleaned up. So that was pretty straightforward. Once all these flanges were cut, then all I needed to do was remove the hoses. I did have to use a crowbar to force the hoses off, and I figured if I tore the hose, I would just replace it. Glove fingers make good flange covers. The tank had some fuel in it, and the fumes were pretty bad. Here I set up a ladder with a piece of aluminum on the top rung with the come-along in the fuel gauge sender hole to lift the tank out. It took quite a bit of force to get the tank to pop free of the foam, and quite a bit of cutting to get access. I just kept cutting until I was able to remove the tank. I figured I would reglass anything that I needed later. And here's the tank coming up. And here's some of the cutting that I had to do. Fortunately, that plate really only sits on about 1/4 inch of that flange, so I was able to get it out without completely removing it. And here's the tank is free of the boat. Here's a view of this whole setup. Here's the tank after this ladder was removed, and you can see one of the holes in the tank. Here's a little closer and even closer view. This is why manufacturers do not foam in tanks anymore. When you hold moisture against aluminum, it crumbles, and I could put my finger through this tank in a couple different areas. Again, it's 18 years old, but it probably would have lasted longer if it wasn't foamed in. So here's the tank removed from the boat, and here is the foam mess, which I ended up scraping all of the foam out. Here's a view of the foam across the front bulkhead, and there's the raw fiberglass under. Here's all the foam under the tank. There was a lot of foam. I bet I removed 5 or 6 5-gallon buckets of foam, and scraping it out was about 1 inch at a time. It took a couple nights to get all this foam out. The stuff really doesn't want to come out. And it was soaked with gas It was a real mess. I used some acetone in the very bottom to help draw some of the moisture out of the fiberglass, and after leaving a fan in it overnight, got it completely bone dry and was able to get all of the gas fume smell out. Here's the new supports for the bottom of the tank. They're starboard slats cut to about 2 inches. I used a planer to take the edges off, drilled holes, those are 1/2 inch holes, about every 6 inches, and then cut 2 kerfs down the middle, and I'll show you what that's for in a moment. I used 610 to epoxy the back of the starboard down to the hull. And if you've ever used starboard, you know that nothing really sticks to it. So by drilling these holes and filling them with 610 and taking a putty knife and folding over the overflow into the kerf, you end up with a epoxy rivet, so to speak, to hold these in place. I let them tack up. I didn't let them dry completely before I put the tank in, and that way there is some adhesion to the tank just to keep it from moving around while I was working on it. So here's the tank ready to go in. This was a 2-person job to get the tank down in, and then I put some concrete blocks on top to simulate weight before I screwed the flanges into the stringers where the old flanges were. Because I want an air gap all the way around the tank, I won't be foaming this tank in. I built these cardboard boxes to retain the 610 adhesive that I filled. Here it is uncured, and here it is almost cured, and here we go all the way cured. So by doing this, I built basically custom mounts right up against the irregular side of the stringer on all 4 flanges to hold the tank in place. Worked out really well. Here's the piece of fiberglass that I epoxied in to repair the area I had to cut to get the tank out. The deck only sits on that little 1/4 inch bit of original material. The material I added is just for the 2 screws that hold it down. Also, there was some sponginess in the deck right there where the deck had separated from the bulkhead slightly, and I was able to repair that so it's not spongy anymore. Here's a view of the new wire run, which is shorter. It was unnecessary to have it go all the way forward. Here's the old screws that held the console down. I replaced them with nuts and bolts. That console would continuously loosen up. Here's a view of all 4 for the front. I think there's about 6 in the back. The console will be very secure now. Here's the fuel line that goes back to the motor. Went ahead and installed that and put the fuel fill and the vent back on. Here's the mess of wires. I was able to eliminate some wires, shorten some, really clean that up. And then one of these mounting nuts or screws had the potential to chafe against the wires, so I just gobbed it up with silicone to prevent it from metal touching those wires. So here's a cleaned up version of the wiring and rigging. Here's a simpler way to keep that console up, and you can see that blue line that runs up to the bow. I zip tied it to the fuel fill and to the cross member there on the wire run to keep it up off the tank, and it's pretty tight, so nothing should slap against the tank while underway. Shouldn't have any vibration in there. Here's the console lowered back down into position, and I began the work of scraping all the old silicone. This was probably a 3-night job. Vacuuming and scraping, and then I used a couple different products to clean it up. Mostly just polish. I used Flitz. That seemed to remove the residue pretty well. So once I had everything cleaned up and ready, I went ahead and siliconed in the console. and then positioned the deck back in place so that I could put fuel in it. I wanted to put fuel in the boat first so that I could look at the fuel fill and the vent and make sure that nothing was leaking, because those were the original hoses. I decided not to replace those because I would have had to cut access plates to get to them, and they seem to be in good condition. I cleaned out the bilge. The tank was leaking, so the bilge was filled with oily residue, so made a little bubble bath in my bilge and got that all cleaned up, so I'll be able to see if any fuel is leaking. And here's the moment of truth, and nothing leaked. So as I mentioned, I used Flitz to clean this up and then began filling everything with silicone. Here I'm filling these screw holes with silicone. Over the years, the screws have gone down too deep into the deck, so by putting little lock washers, I was able to get enough clearance to keep the screws at the original height. And then I proceeded to just fill that gap with silicone. I really hate working with silicone. There's just so much opportunity for error. What I did this time, which was different, is once I got the edge I wanted in the bead, in the gap, I left that excess silicone to cure and then scraped it up later. That worked out much better than trying to clean it up and risk ruining the bead. So here's a view of it completed. I'm going to let it cure for about a week before I give that deck a good scrubbing. And that is how you replace a fuel tank in a flats boat. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Hope you enjoyed the video.